this. Imagine this. You're cleaning your kitchen and you find a shopping list on the counter. The handwriting is undeniably yours. The familiar loop of your G, the way you cross your T's, but the words are a stranger's. A list of items for a crime you would never commit. Today, I'm going to share 4 true, deeply unsettling stories from people who were haunted not by a ghost, but by their own hand. It is a fear that cuts deeper than any external threat. The horror isn't that a monster is trying to get in Dodd. It's the chilling possibility that the monster might already be inside you, using your hand as its puppet. Dodd. It's the ultimate form of psychological violation, a betrayal by your own mind, leaving you to question your sanity, your memories, and every action you might have taken when you weren't paying attention. This is the terror of not being able to trust yourself. But are these moments a sign of a fracturing mind, or is it evidence of something else? Something reaching out through you? By exploring these real accounts, from a simple posted on a mirror to a terrifying note found after a night of sleepwalking, we will confront the chilling possibility that we are not always in control. These stories are a disturbing look into the dark corners of the human psyche, and they hold a warning you cannot afford to ignore. Now, before we read the writing on the wall, make sure you are subscribed to Whispered Fear and have activated the bell. You don't want to miss the memo when your own subconscious decides to send a message.
Don't forget the lime.
Our first story is about the quiet horror of losing oneself. It comes from a man named Ben Carter, a 35-year-old financial analyst who learned that the most terrifying messages don't come from a stalker or a ghost, but from a stranger who shares your own face, your own memories, and your own handwriting. He learned that sometimes the call is coming from inside the house, but you're the one holding the phone. Ben's life had, for lack of a better term, imploded. 6 months ago, he'd had a corner office on the 42nd floor of the Wells Fargo Center in downtown Minneapolis, a long-term girlfriend, and a life mapped out with predictable, logical precision. Then, the market turned. His department was downsized. His job, a casualty of a corporate restructuring he himself had helped model. The stress, the long hours, it all took its toll. His relationship fractured under the weight of it, ending in a quiet, soul-crushing finality. He was adrift. So he ran. He packed what was left of his life into his car and drove east, chasing a job offer from PNC Financial Services. He landed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a city of steel and hills that felt as gritty and resilient as he hoped to be. He found a small rental house in the South Side Slopes, a neighborhood of narrow, winding streets and old vertical houses that seemed to cling to the hillside for dear life. The house on St. Thomas Street was a fixer-upper, but it was his, a place to start over, a place to be alone and rebuilt. The first few weeks were a blur of unpacking, painting, and job hunting online. The house was his project, a tangible problem he could solve. He fixed a leaky faucet, replaced a broken window pane, and grew to know the house's personality. The groan of the old furnace in the basement, the way the floorboards on the second floor creaked in a specific pattern. He was lonely, stressed about his dwindling savings, but for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of control. The house was his sanctuary, a quiet fortress against the failures of his past. The headaches started in the second month, dull, persistent, throbbing aches that settled behind his eyes. He blamed stress, eye strain from staring at his laptop all day applying for jobs. He started feeling dizzy at odd times, a momentary, disorienting vertigo as he stood up from a chair. He felt perpetually tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that no amount of coffee could penetrate. His memory, once a razor-sharp tool of his trade, felt fuzzy at the edges. He would walk into a room and forget why he was there, He would lose his train of thought mid-sentence. It was all. He told himself, part of the package. The physiological cost of his life imploding. He just had to push through it. He found the first list on a Monday morning. It was on a notepad on the kitchen counter, written in his own neat, slightly angled handwriting. It was a typical grocery list. Milk, eggs, coffee, bread, bleach. He paused on the last item. Bleach? He didn't need bleach. He had a full bottle under the sink. He shrugged, a small frown on his face. He must have written it down absent-mindedly, his brain on autopilot. He tore the page off, threw it away, and forgot about it. A week later, he found the second list. He was heading out to the Giant Eagle on Warden Street for his weekly grocery run. He grabbed the notepad from the counter to write a new list, and saw there was already one there. It was written on the back of an old bank statement in his own unmistakable script. The list had 3 items: rope, duct tape, lime. He stared at the words, his blood turning to ice. The handwriting was perfect. The familiar, confident way he formed his R, the sharp, decisive cross of his T. It was his dot, but he had absolutely no memory of writing it. He tried to place it, to find a context. Was it for a home repair project? He hadn't needed rope or lime for anything. A prank? No one had been in his house. His doors were always locked. He stood in his quiet kitchen, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator, and felt the first true tendril of a fear he had never known before. A fear of his own mind. Was he losing time? Was he having blackouts, doing things, writing things that he had no memory of? The headaches, the dizziness, the fogginess, were they symptoms of something more than just stress? He tore the note into tiny, angry pieces and threw it in the trash, an act of violent denial. He tried to push it from his mind, but the image of the list, of those 3 words in his own hand, was seared into his memory. The paranoia began to creep in. He started conducting small, secret experiments. He would write a note to himself. It is Tuesday, 10:15 a.m., and leave it on his desk. He would come back an hour later and find a second note, in his own handwriting, placed right. Next to it, no, it's not. He started finding other things. A book from his bookshelf placed in the refrigerator. A single sock, not his own, folded neatly on his pillow. Each discovery was a small, quiet act of psychological warfare, a battle he seemed to be fighting against himself. He did what any logical person would do. He reinforced his fortress. He went to a local locksmith and had the locks on his doors replaced with high-security Medico deadbolts. He bought a simple, affordable Wise cam and placed it on the mantelpiece. In his living room, it's small, black lens covering the main entrance and the kitchen doorway. The camera was his new anchor to reality. It would be his objective witness dot. It would prove that no one was getting in. Or it would prove that he was, in fact, going insane. He watched the footage religiously. Hours of it. He saw himself walking around, making coffee, watching TV. He saw the quiet, empty rooms when he was asleep. But he saw no one else. No intruders. No pranksters. The camera confirmed his deepest fear. The things that were happening in his house were being done by the only person there. Him. He stood in his quiet kitchen, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator, and felt the first true tendril of a fear he had never known before. A fear of his own mind. Was he losing time? Was he having blackouts, doing things, writing things that he had no memory of? The headaches, the dizziness, the fogginess, were they symptoms of something more than just stress? He tore the note into tiny, angry pieces and threw it in the trash, an act of violent denial. He tried to push it from his mind, but the image of the list, of those 3 words in his own hand, was seared into his memory. The paranoia began to creep in. He started conducting small, secret experiments. He would write a note to himself. It is Tuesday, 10:15 a.m., and leave it on his desk. He would come back an hour later and find a second note, in his own handwriting, placed right. Next to it, no, it's not. He started finding other things. A book from his bookshelf placed in the refrigerator. A single sock, not his own, folded neatly on his pillow. Each discovery was a small, quiet act of psychological warfare, a battle he seemed to be fighting against himself. He did what any logical person would do. He reinforced his fortress. He went to a local locksmith and had the locks on his doors replaced with high-security Medico deadbolts. He bought a simple, affordable Wise cam and placed it on the mantelpiece. In his living room, it's small, black lens covering the main entrance and the kitchen doorway. The camera was his new anchor to reality. It would be his objective witness dot. It would prove that no one was getting in, or it would prove that he was, in fact, going insane. He watched the footage religiously, hours of it. He saw himself walking around, making coffee, watching TV. He saw the quiet, empty rooms when he was asleep, but he saw no one else, no intruders. No pranksters. The camera confirmed his deepest fear. The things that were happening in his house were being done by the only person there, him. The furnace, the old gas-powered beast that sat in the corner, the one that groaned and roared to life on cold nights. He staggered towards it, his phone's flashlight cutting a trembling beam through the gloom, and he saw it, a long, dark, jagged crack running down the side of the furnace's heat exchanger, a flaw that was almost invisible to the naked eye. And from the crack, a faint, shimmering heat haze was leaking into the air. Carbon monoxide, a silent, odorless, colorless poison. It had been leaking into his house for months, slowly, steadily, starving his brain of oxygen. The headaches, the dizziness, the memory loss. It wasn't stress. It was poison. The notes, the moved objects, the paranoia. It was him. It had been him all along. His own mind, damaged and disoriented by the gas, turning against itself. The shopping list, with its terrifying items, was likely just a collection of random words he had seen on a TV show or read in a book. His poisoned brain, seizing on them and writing them down, stripped of all context. He wasn't going mad. He was dying. He scrambled back up the stairs, burst out of the back door, and collapsed onto the wet grass of his backyard, gulping in the cold, clean, rainy air. He lay there for a long time, the rain washing over him, his mind slowly, painfully, beginning to clear. He dialed 911. The Pittsburgh Bureau of Fire arrived within minutes, their alarms blaring. The firefighters, wearing breathing apparatus, entered the house, their CO detectors shrieking immediately. They confirmed the levels were lethal. They told him he was lucky to be alive. He recovered. Physically, at least. He broke his lease, and the house on St. Thomas Street was condemned, a quiet monument to a silent poison. But the psychological scars remain. He is haunted by the knowledge that for 2 months he had been a stranger to himself, a ghost in his own life, writing missives from a mind that was not his own. He is left with the terrifying, unshakable truth that the most dangerous threats are often the ones we cannot see, or hear, or smell. And he is haunted by the memory of the notes, of the lists, of the chilling evidence that proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the most terrifying monster you can ever face is the one that writes with your own hand.
Look at yourself.
Our next story is about the terrifying intimacy of a message from an unknown part of oneself. It comes from a woman named Olivia, a pediatric nurse whose life was dedicated to caring for others. She was a fortress of compassion and competence, a steady hand in moments of crisis. She learned, in the most violating way possible, that while she was busy taking care of the world, something inside her own mind was watching her, leaving her terrifying little notes in the one place. She was forced to confront herself every single morning, The bathroom mirror. Olivia's life was a meticulously organized symphony of controlled chaos. She lived in a small but charming apartment in the Shadyside neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a historic area known for its beautiful old buildings and tree-lined streets. Her building on Walnut Street was a pre-war brownstone, full of the kind of architectural quirks that she adored. Her job at UPMC Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh was demanding, both physically and emotionally. The 12-hour shifts, the constant dance with life and death, the weight of caring for sick children. It all took its toll, but she loved it. It gave her purpose. Her apartment was her sanctuary, a place to decompress, to recharge, to be silent after a day filled with the sounds of beeping machines and crying children. Her routine was her armor. She would come home, exhausted, change out of her scrubs, and spend an hour in absolute silence, just letting the day wash away. She was single, a state of being she was mostly content with, though the loneliness could be a heavy blanket on quiet nights. She was a creature of habit, of order. Her life, like the medical charts she so carefully maintained, was a system of checks and balances. The first note appeared on a Wednesday. She woke up before her alarm. The sky outside still a dark, inky blue. She stumbled into the bathroom, her mind still foggy with sleep, and flicked on the vanity light. And there it was, a single bright yellow post-it note stuck to the center of her medicine cabinet mirror. The note had one word, written in a neat, familiar script. Watching. She stared at it, her sleep-addled brain struggling to find a context. Her first thought was that it was a joke, a prank by her best friend, Megan, who had a spare key and a mischievous sense of humor. But the handwriting, it was hers, unmistakably. The precise, slightly slanted cursive she had developed over years of writing nurses' notes. She peeled the post-it from the mirror. The back was just sticky, normal. She looked around the small bathroom. Nothing was out of place. The window was locked. The door had been locked. She threw the note in the trash, a cold knot of confusion in her stomach. She must have written it herself. She'd been working double shifts. She was exhausted. She must have done it in a moment of sleep-deprived autopilot and simply forgotten. It was the only logical explanation. But the word itself, watching, it was so specific, so unsettling. Who was watching, or what? She went about her day, the strange note, a low-grade hum of anxiety in the back of her mind. When she got home that night, she searched the apartment. She checked every closet, under the bed, behind the shower curtain. The apartment was empty, secure. She felt a little foolish, but the act of searching, of confirming her solitude, was a comfort. Before bed, she took a blank post-it pad from her desk drawer and placed it in the kitchen, far from the bathroom. A small logical test. If she was writing notes in her sleep, she would have to get up, walk to the kitchen, get a note, and return to the bathroom. Surely she would remember that. The first note appeared on a Wednesday. She woke up before her alarm. The sky outside still a dark, inky blue. She stumbled into the bathroom, her mind still foggy with sleep, and flicked on the vanity light, and there it was, a single bright yellow post-it note stuck to the center of her medicine cabinet mirror. The note had one word, written in a neat, familiar script. Watching, she stared at it, her sleep-addled brain struggling to find a context. Her first thought was that it was a joke, a prank by her best friend, Megan, who had a spare key and a mischievous sense of humor. But the handwriting, it was hers, unmistakably. The precise, slightly slanted cursive she had developed over years of writing nurses' notes. She peeled the post-it from the mirror. The back was just sticky, normal. She looked around the small bathroom. Nothing was out of place. The window was locked. The door had been locked. She threw the note in the trash, a cold knot of confusion in her stomach. She must have written it herself. She'd been working double shifts. She was exhausted. She must have done it in a moment of sleep-deprived autopilot and simply forgotten. It was the only logical explanation. But the word itself, watching, it was so specific, so unsettling. Who was watching, or what? She went about her day, the strange note a low-grade hum of anxiety in the back of her mind. When she got home that night, she searched the apartment. She checked every closet, under the bed, behind the shower curtain. The apartment was empty, secure. She felt a little foolish, but the act of searching, of confirming her solitude, was a comfort. Before bed, she took a blank post-it pad from her desk drawer and placed it in the fonts of it. Kitchen, far from the bathroom. A small logical test. If she was writing notes in her sleep, she would have to get up, walk to the kitchen, get a note, and return to the bathroom. Surely she would remember that. She thought about seeing a doctor, a psychiatrist. But what would she say? That she was leaving herself threatening notes? It sounded like a textbook case of a dissociative disorder. She was afraid of the diagnosis, afraid of being medicated, of being told that the competent, in-control woman she thought she was a fiction. And a small, terrified part of her wondered if it wasn't a medical issue at all. If it was something else. Something that was using her hand, her mind as a sea vessel. Desperate, she decided to fight back with technology. She bought a small, motion-activated nanny cam, the kind hidden in an alarm clock, and placed it on the vanity in her bathroom, its lens covering the mirror and the door. If she was getting up and writing these notes, she would have a recording of it. She would have proof. The first night with the camera was agonizing. She barely slept, her ears straining for any sound of movement, her eyes darting towards the bathroom door. The morning came, and she woke, exhausted. She walked into the bathroom with a sense of dread. There was a note on the mirror. It read, "Clever girl," but I saw it first. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. It knew. It had seen the camera. She rushed to the living room and grabbed her laptop, her hand shaking as she pulled the SD card from the alarm clock camera and inserted it into the reader. She opened the video file. The footage showed the dark, silent bathroom. The timestamp in the corner read 3:19 a.m. Then, the bathroom light flicked on. She watched, her heart pounding, as she herself walked into the frame, her own body. But it wasn't her. The way she moved was wrong. It was too smooth, too deliberate. Her eyes were open, but they were blank, unfocused, like a sleepwalker's. She watched this other version of herself walk to the vanity, pick up the post-it pad and a pen, and write the note. She watched it stick the note to the mirror. Then, the other her turned. It looked around the room, its blank eyes scanning the space. And then it stopped, its head tilting as its gaze landed directly on the alarm clock on the vanity. The figure stood perfectly still for a full minute, its head cocked as if studying the small, hidden lens. A slow, cold smile spread across its face. Her face. It was a smile of amusement, of contempt. Then, it raised a hand and waved, a small, mocking gesture directly at the camera. It turned, flicked off the light, and walked out of the bathroom. The video ended. Olivia stared at the screen, a wave of pure, undiluted terror washing over her. She had proof. But the proof was more horrifying than she could have ever imagined. The thing that was writing the notes was not a separate personality. It was not a medical condition. It was an entity, a separate, intelligent, and malevolent consciousness that was inhabiting her body while she slept. It was a parasite, and it was playing with her. She knew she couldn't stay in the apartment, but where could she go? The thing wasn't in the house. It was inside her. The final note appeared 2 nights later. She had been staying at her friend Megan's apartment, terrified to be alone. But she had to go back to her own place to get some clothes for work. She entered the apartment in the middle of the afternoon. the bright sunlight a comforting but flimsy shield. She walked into the bathroom, her eyes instinctively drawn to the mirror. There was no post-it note. She let out a shaky breath of relief. She opened the medicine cabinet, and her world fell apart. The entire back wall of the cabinet was covered in them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of yellow post-it notes, overlapping each other like the scales of some horrifying yellow beast. Each one was covered in her own neat handwriting, but the words were a chaotic, terrifying jumble, a stream of consciousness from a mind that was not her own. Some were threats. Get out of my house. Some were observations. She's afraid of spiders. Some were possessive. This body is mine now. And some were just a single, terrifying word, written over and over. Watching. Watching. She backed away, a scream building in her throat. She had been living a lie for months. This thing hadn't just been visiting in her sleep, that had been living inside her, watching through her eyes, learning her secrets, her fears, her life. She turned to run, but as she did, she caught her own reflection in the mirror. And in that moment, she felt it, a profound, sickening, internal shift. It was like a switch being flipped in her own mind. Her control over her own body suddenly felt loose. Her own hand raised, seemingly of its own volition. She watched, horrified, as her own fingers reached out, peeled a blank post-it note from the pad on the vanity, and picked up a pen. She could feel her own muscles moving, but she was no longer the one giving the commands. She was a passenger in her own body, a terrified ghost in her own machine. She watched as her hand began to write on the note, the script a perfect, calm imitation of her own. She didn't know what it was writing, but she knew with a certainty that was the death of all hope, that this message was not for her. It was for the next person who would find her, the person who would have to figure out what had happened to the quiet, competent nurse named Olivia. The last thing she saw before her own eyes looked back at her from the mirror with a cold, triumphant smile was the single word her hand was writing on. The small yellow square. The word was help.
Don't read it.
Our next story is about the sanctity of the self and the terrifying realization that your own personal history can be rewritten without your knowledge. It comes from a teenager named Maya, who learned that the most reliable narrator, her own past self, could become a stranger, a liar, a monster. She discovered that her diary wasn't just a keeper of secrets, but a cage, and she was trapped on the outside, looking in at a life she had apparently lived, but could not, for the life of her. Remember, at 17, Maya's world was a small, fragile ecosystem built on the foundations of routine and control. 6 months prior, her family had moved from the sprawling, sun-baked suburbs of Austin, Texas, to the quiet, lakeside city of Burlington, Vermont. Her father, a software engineer, had been transferred to a new office with the tech company IDX Systems. For her parents, it was a fresh start, a charming New England adventure. For Maya, it was an amputation. She had been severed from her friends, her school, her life. The vibrant, chaotic world she knew was replaced by the quiet, reserved culture of a town that felt a century older and a world away. Their new home was a rented townhouse in the South End, a neighborhood of old, repurposed industrial buildings and quiet, tree-lined streets that led down to the vast, gray expanse of Lake Champlain. She felt like an alien, a stranger navigating a foreign landscape. Her only confidant, her only true friend in this new, cold world was her diary. It was a simple, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her sharp, analytical handwriting. In it, she documented the mundane realities of her life, her frustration with her new school, Burlington High, her loneliness, her small, quiet observations of the people at the coffee shops on Church Street Marketplace, where she would try to study The diary was her anchor. It was the proof of her own existence. The one place where her thoughts were linear, her feelings were valid, and her memory was secure. The first crack in her reality was almost imperceptible. It was a Tuesday evening in November. She was in her room, the sound of a cold wind whistling off the lake rattling her window pane. She opened her diary to write about a particularly awkward encounter in the school cafeteria. As she flipped to a new page, her eyes caught on the previous day's entry, dated Monday, November 14th. The entry was about her walk home from school. It described, in her own handwriting, a brief, pleasant conversation she'd had with a friendly golden retriever and its owner on the Burlington Greenway. It described a specific shade of red on the man's jacket, the way the dog had licked her hand. It was a perfectly normal, cheerful entry, except it hadn't happened. Maya stared at the page, a cold knot of confusion tightening in her stomach. She hadn't walked home on the Greenway on Monday. It had been raining. She had taken the bus. She remembered it vividly. The smell of wet wool, the squeak of the wipers, the condensation on the windows. She hadn't seen a dog. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She read the entry again. The handwriting was hers. The pen was the same black Muji gel pen she always used, but the memory was not. Her first thought was a simple, logical one. She had written it on the wrong day. She must have had that encounter on Sunday and simply dated the entry incorrectly. It was a plausible mistake. She clung to it, a life raft in a suddenly uncertain sea of her own memory. She turned the page and started writing about her day, forcing the strange, misplaced entry from her mind. But the misplaced moments began to multiply. A week later, she found an entry detailing a trip to a local art gallery, the BCA Center, an event she had no memory of. The entry described, with a critic's precision, her feelings about a specific abstract painting, a piece she had supposedly stared at for 20 minutes. The next day, she went to the gallery. The painting was there, exactly as described in her diary, but she had no memory of ever seeing it before. A profound and terrifying schism began to form in her mind. There was the life she remembered living, and there was the life that was documented in her own hand on the pages of her diary, and the two were beginning to diverge. She started to feel like she was losing her mind. She was a teenager, a demographic already prone to mood swings and emotional turmoil. Was this something more? A neurological issue? The early onset of a serious mental illness? The fear was a cold, constant companion. She became obsessed with her own memory, constantly testing herself, trying to recall the details of the previous day, terrified she would find another blank space, another period of lost time that her diary had diligently recorded. She considered telling her parents, but how could she explain that her own diary was gaslighting her? They were already worried about how she was adapting to the move. A confession like this, she feared, would land her in a therapist's office, or worse, so she kept her terrifying secret to herself. Her diary now transformed from a confidant into a silent, alien artifact that documented a life she wasn't living. The true horror of her situation was revealed on a cold Saturday in December. She had spent the entire day at a mandatory, all-day debate tournament at South Burlington High School. It was a grueling, exhausting event, but it was also a perfect alibi. She had been in a crowded auditorium, surrounded by dozens of students and teachers. From 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., her presence was verifiable, undeniable. She came home that night, her body aching, her mind numbed. She collapsed onto her bed, too tired to even open her diary. It was the first night in months she hadn't written in it. The next morning, she woke late. She sat at her desk, a cup of tea in her hand, and opened the diary, intending to write about the tournament. But when she opened it to the page for Saturday, December 3rd, it was already full. Her blood ran cold. The page was covered, from top to bottom, in her own neat, Analytical script, but the story it told was not of a debate tournament. It was a detailed, horrifying, and impossible account of a crime. The entry began. I didn't mean for it to happen. I was just angry. She read on, her hands shaking so hard the pages rattled. The entry described, in vivid sensory detail, an argument she had supposedly had with another student, a boy from her school named Ethan, whom she barely knew. It described following him from the school, down the bike path that ran along the Winooski River. It described the cold, biting wind, the gray, churning water of the river. And then it described the shove. The diary entry was a confession, a detailed, remorseless confession to pushing Ethan off the bike path and into the freezing, fast-moving river. The entry ended with a single chilling sentence. He wasn't a strong swimmer. I watched for a minute. Then I went home. No one saw. Maya threw the diary across the room as if it were on fire. She stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. This wasn't a forgotten conversation with the dog walker. This wasn't a forgotten trip to an art gallery. This was murder. And her own hand had written the confession. Her mind was a maelstrom of terror and denial. It's not real. I was at the tournament. I was there all day. I have an alibi. She frantically grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen. She needed proof. She pulled up the local news website, the Burlington Free Press, her heart pounding. And there it was. The headline at the top of the page. Local teen missing after disappearing near Winooski River. Police suspect foul play. The article identified the missing boy as Ethan Miller, a 17-year-old junior at Burlington High. He was last seen on Saturday afternoon. He had told his parents he was going for a walk along the river. He had never come home. Maya let out a choked, strangled sob. It was real. A boy was missing, presumed dead, and her own diary, her own hand, had claimed responsibility. For the next 2 days, she lived in a fog of pure, undiluted terror. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She couldn't look at her own hands without feeling a wave of revulsion. What was happening to her? Was she capable of such a thing? Could she have somehow left the tournament, gone to the river, committed this horrible act, and then returned, her mind completely wiping the memory? Was she a monster? She hid the diary in the back of her closet, under a pile of old sweaters, terrified of what she might find if she opened it again. The police investigation into Ethan's disappearance was all over the news. They were searching the river. They were asking for witnesses. And every news report felt like a personal accusation. The answer, the revelation, came not from a new diary entry, but from an old one. On the third day of her self-imposed torment, a thought occurred to her. The pen. The black Muji gel pen she always used. She had been using the same pen for months. She knew that the ink level was getting low. She retrieved the diary from its hiding place, her hands trembling. She flipped back through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries from the past few weeks, the ones she remembered writing, and the ones she didn't. She looked at the ink and its color, its consistency, and she saw it. The entries she remembered writing, the real ones, were written in a slightly faded, grayish-black ink, the sign of a pen running low. But the other entries, the dog walker, the art gallery, and the horrifying confession, were written in a crisp, dark, solid black. The ink was different. It was from a new pen. A new pen. But the handwriting was identical. How was that possible? And then another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The school. She remembered something from a few weeks ago. A new girl had transferred to her English class. A quiet, watchful girl named Chloe. Chloe had accidentally bumped into her in the hallway, knocking Maya's books to the floor. Chloe had been so apologetic, helping her gather her things, helping her pick up her books, her papers, and her diary, which had fallen open. Chloe had also accidentally borrowed her pen that day. returning it at the end of class. It was a flimsy connection, a desperate grasp at a rational explanation, but it was something. That afternoon, she confronted Chloe in the school library. She didn't have a plan. She just walked up to the table where Chloe was sitting and placed her diary on the table. Between them, Maya's voice was surprisingly steady. "I think you've been writing in my book." Chloe looked up from her textbook. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't defensive. She just smiled. A slow, cold, predatory smile. She said simply, You have such lovely handwriting. It wasn't hard to learn." Maya whispered, the single word a universe of confusion and fear. Why? Chloe's voice was a low, venomous hiss. "Because you have everything. The new house, the nice parents, the perfect little life. You came here and you just fit. I've lived in this town my whole life, and I've never fit. I thought it was time someone showed you that perfect little lives can break." Maya's voice cracked. "Ethan, what did you do to Ethan?" Chloe's smile widened. "I didn't do anything to Ethan. Ethan is fine. His parents just took him on a surprise weekend trip to visit his grandparents in Albany. They just forgot to tell the school." She leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with a terrifying, sociopathic glee. But wasn't it exciting? For a few days? To think you were a monster? To not be able to trust your own mind, your own memory? The world tilted. The confession. The missing person report. It had all been a lie. A meticulously crafted psychological torture chamber designed by this quiet, smiling girl. She had stolen the pen to get a perfect ink match. She had studied her handwriting. She had watched her, learned her routines, her secrets, and she had hacked the local news website. A simple task for a girl who was a known coding prodigy to post a fake headline, knowing it would be the first thing Maya would look for, the thing that would break her completely. The police were called. Chloe confessed to everything, not with remorse, but with a chilling theatrical pride. She was a minor, and the crime was psychological, not physical. She was sent to a juvenile psychiatric facility. But for Maya, the story doesn't end. The monster was real, and it was caught. But the experience left a permanent scar. She had lived for weeks in a world where she could not trust her own memory, her own hand. She had been forced to confront the terrifying possibility that she was capable of monstrous things. She still keeps a diary, but she writes in a different color ink every single day. And she knows that the most terrifying secrets are not the ones that are written down, but the ones that are planted like seeds in the fertile soil of your own self-doubt, the ones that make you question the very nature of who you are. And she knows that sometimes the most dangerous monster is not the one hiding under your bed. It's the one sitting next to you in class, smiling, just waiting for you to look away. Our final story is about the terrifying wilderness that exists not in the mountains or the forests, but within the uncharted territory of our own minds. It comes from a man named Liam, a new father who learned that sleep is not a refuge, but a doorway, and that the person who walks in your shoes while you are dreaming may be a stranger with a dark, unknowable purpose, leaving you cryptic messages from a life you never knew you lived. Liam's world had shrunk in the way that only a new baby can shrink it. His universe was now the four walls of a small, rented bungalow in the Selwood Moorland neighborhood of Portland, Oregon. The house, with its creaky floors and a constant view of the misty Oregon sky, was a chaotic symphony of diapers, late-night feedings, and the beautiful, terrifying fragility of his newborn daughter, Clara. He and his wife, Anna, were deeply in love, but they were also deeply, profoundly exhausted. Liam worked as a landscape architect, a job that required creativity and precision, two resources that were in critically short supply when you were operating on 90-minute increments of broken sleep. His life was a blur of caffeine and anxiety, a constant, low-grade fear that he would make a mistake, either at his desk at the downtown firm or at home with the tiny, perfect human who depended on him for everything. He had a history of sleepwalking. It was a childhood affliction, something that had faded in his late teens and that he had relegated to a quirky family anecdote. But in the weeks after Clara was born, under the immense pressure of new fatherhood and crippling sleep deprivation, it had returned. It started small. Anna would wake him, telling him she'd found him standing in the hallway, staring at the wall, his eyes open but vacant. He would have no memory of it, just a vague, unsettling feeling of having been somewhere else. They laughed it off at first, but the incidents grew more complex. He once woke up to find he had meticulously rearranged all the books on their bookshelf by color. Another time, he had taken every single pot and pan out of the kitchen cabinets and arranged them in a perfect, concentric circle on the living room floor. His nocturnal activities were strange but harmless, annoying but not frightening. They were, he and Anna reasoned, the bizarre manifestations of a mind under extreme stress. He started seeing a sleep specialist at OHSU who prescribed medication and relaxation techniques. For a while, it seemed to work. The sleepwalking stopped. The fortress of their small, happy, exhausted family felt secure once more. The relapse began on a Tuesday morning. He woke up on the couch, which was unusual, but not unheard of. But this time was different. He was fully dressed, in his clothes from the day before. His shoes were on, and they were caked in a thick, dark riverbank mud. And he was cold. A deep, penetrating cold that had settled into his bones. He looked at his hands. His fingernails were packed with the same dark, wet soil. Anna asked, standing in the doorway to the living room, a look of sleepy confusion on her face. Liam, what are you doing out here? Did you fall asleep watching TV? He didn't know what to say. He had no memory of leaving the bed, of getting dressed, of going outside. He just stared at the mud on his shoes, a cold, hard knot of fear tightening in his stomach. He had been somewhere. And he had taken the memory of it with him, but left the physical evidence behind. He tried to pass it off as a one-time, particularly bad episode. He scrubbed the mud from his shoes, cleaned his fingernails, and went to work. The secret of his nocturnal journey, a heavy weight in his mind. But that night, as he was emptying his pockets to do the laundry, he found it. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper, tucked deep into the pocket of his jeans. It was a page torn from the small, moleskin notebook he kept by the bed, and on it, written in his own familiar, architectural scrawl, was a short, cryptic, and terrifying message. It read, "I buried them under the old oak tree." He stared at the note, the words blurring in front of his eyes. Them? Buried them? What did it mean? It sounded like a confession to a crime he had no memory of committing. His mind reeled. The mud on his shoes, the dirt under his fingernails. Had he hurt someone? Buried something? The thought was a physical blow, a monstrous, unthinkable violation of who he believed himself to be. He didn't tell Anna. How could he? How could he tell his wife that he was afraid of himself? That a part of him, a secret, nocturnal self, was apparently walking the earth, burying things in the dark, and leaving him terrifying little notes as souvenirs? The fear became a poison. He started to dread the night. He would lie in bed, fighting sleep, terrified of what his body might do once his conscious mind was gone. He felt like a man chained to a monster, and the monster wore his own face. He started setting up barricades. He would pile books in front of the bedroom door, hoping the noise of them falling would wake him or Anna. But every few mornings, he would wake up on the couch, the books neatly stacked back on the shelf, with fresh dirt on his shoes and no memory of how it got there. He had to know. He was an architect, a man who solved problems with data and observation. He decided to apply the same logic to the terrifying mystery of himself. He went to a Best Buy on, say, 82nd Avenue and bought a set of wireless security cameras. He placed one in the living room, aimed at the front door. He placed another in his bedroom, aimed at the bed. And he placed a third outside, hidden in the branches of the magnolia tree in their front yard, its lens covering the driveway and the street. He was going to watch himself. He was going to become the sole audience for his own private horror movie. For a week, the camera showed him nothing but the quiet, mundane life of his family. He would watch the footage, a strange, voyeuristic feeling washing over him as he saw himself sleeping, unaware. The lack of activity was a relief, but also a frustration. He needed an answer. Then, on a Friday night, he captured it. He woke up on the couch again, the familiar bone-deep cold, a sure sign that he had been out. He immediately went to his laptop and pulled up the camera footage from the night. The video from the bedroom camera showed him at 2:17 a.m. sitting up in bed. His movements were slow, fluid, and purposeful. His eyes were open, but blank, unfocused. He wasn't asleep. He was someone else. He watched, horrified, as this other version of himself stood up, got dressed with an eerie efficiency, and walked out of the bedroom. The living room camera picked him up a moment later. He saw himself walk to the front door, remove the pile of books with a steady hand, unlock the deadbolt, and leave the house. The outdoor camera showed him getting into his car and driving away into the darkness. He fast-forwarded through the footage, his heart pounding. For 2 hours, there was nothing. Then, just before 5 a.m., the car returned. He watched himself park, get out, and walk back into the house. He was covered in mud. He relocked the door, replaced the pile of books exactly as it had been, and then simply lay down on the couch and closed his eyes. He had proof. But the proof was a nightmare. His sleepwalking wasn't just a random, harmless wandering dot. It was a mission. A deliberate, organized, and secret life that his body was living without him. He knew he had to know where he was going, what he was doing. He started leaving a GPS tracker in his car, but every time he sleepwalked, he would wake to find the tracker on the kitchen counter, its battery removed. His other self was smart dot. It knew it was being watched, and it was covering its tracks. The final piece of the puzzle came from the note itself, the one that started it all. I buried them under the old oak tree. He had become obsessed with those words. He had scoured maps of Portland, looking for prominent oak trees. There were thousands. It was a hopeless task. But then, while cleaning out his car, he found something. A small folded park map, tucked into the pocket of the driver's side door dot. It was a map of the Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge, a large, marshy, and densely wooded park that ran along the Willamette River, not far from their neighborhood. He had no memory of going there. He unfolded the map dot, and on it, a single spot was circled in red ink. A spot deep within the refuge, marked with a small hand-drawn sketch of a large, old oak tree. And next to it, written in his own unmistakable handwriting, were the coordinates. He had to go. He had to know what he had buried. The next day, a Saturday, he told Anna he was going for a hike to clear his head. The lie felt heavy in his mouth. He drove to the refuge, the park map on the passenger seat beside him, a small spade from his garage in a backpack. The air in the park was cool and damp, the ground soft and muddy under his feet. He followed the winding trail, the sounds of the city fading away, replaced by the cry of birds and the rustle of leaves. He found the tree easily dot. It was a massive, ancient Oregon oak. Its branches like gnarled arms reaching for the sky, it stood alone in a small, secluded clearing a few hundred yards from the riverbank. He stood before it, his heart pounding. Ground at its base was disturbed. The dirt and leaves recently turned over. This was the place. He took the spade from his backpack and began to dig. The soil was soft, easy to turn. He dug for nearly an hour, his muscles aching, his mind a storm of terrifying possibilities. What would he find? A body? A weapon? The proof that he was a monster? His spade hit something hard with a dull, metallic thud. He dropped to his knees and cleared the remaining dirt with his bare hands, his fingers digging into the cold, wet earth. He uncovered a small metal box, about the size of a shoebox. It was an old, military-style ammunition can, rusted and heavy-dotted. It was locked with a simple, old-fashioned padlock. He used the spade to break the rusty lock. It snapped with a loud crack. He took a deep, shuddering breath and opened the lid. The box was not filled with anything gruesome. It was filled with wood. Specifically, it was filled with dozens of small, intricate, and breathtakingly beautiful wooden carvings of birds. There were eagles and owls and songbirds, each one carved from a different type of wood. Each one so detailed, so lifelike, it looked as if it could take flight from his hand. He stared at them, a wave of profound, disorienting confusion washing over him. This is what he had been doing? Sneaking out in the dead of night to bury art? He picked up one of the carvings, a small, perfect wren, and as he turned it over in his hand, he saw the initials carved into its base. GC. And in that moment, the world fell away. GC, George Carter. His grandfather. His grandfather had been a master woodcarver, a quiet, gentle man who had passed away when Ben was a teenager. He had been Ben's hero. His grandfather's workshop had been a place of magic, of sawdust and sharp tools, where his grandfather would transform simple blocks of wood into beautiful, living creatures. He had spent hours watching him, mesmerized. His greatest regret was that he had never learned the craft himself. He looked at the carving in his hand, the style, the detail, the specific way the feathers were carved. It was his grandfather's work, but his grandfather's carvings had all been sold at an estate sale years ago. How could this be here? He emptied the box, laying the dozens of birds out on the grass, and at the bottom of the box, he found it, a new moleskin notebook. His notebook. He opened it. The first page contained the note he had found in his pocket. I buried them under the old oak tree. He turned the page. The next page had another entry in his own hand. I think I'm starting to remember how he did it. The way he held the knife. The smell of the cedar. It's coming back. He flipped through the pages. The notebook was a diary, a dream journal, a logbook from his other self. It detailed, in his own handwriting, a life he had been living in his sleep. It described the nighttime drives to a 24-hour Home Depot on Southeast Powell Boulevard to buy blocks of wood and carving tools. It described the long, quiet hours spent in his own cold garage, his hands, guided by a memory deeper than his own, slowly, meticulously, carving the birds from his childhood. And it described the ritualistic journeys to this tree, this spot, to bury the finished pieces, to send them home, as one entry put it. The last entry was from the night before. Tonight, I think I'll finally finish the eagle. It was his favorite. He always said it was the hardest to get right. The eyes. It's all in the eyes. I hope he would be proud. Ben sat there, in the quiet clearing, the woods silent around him, and he wept. He wept for his grandfather. He wept for the lost art that had lived, dormant, in his own hands, and he wept for the stranger that lived inside him. His sleepwalking wasn't a monster. It was a memory, a profound, grieving, subconscious part of himself that was desperately trying to reconnect with the grandfather he had lost. It was a part of him that was trying to finish a conversation that had been cut short 20 years ago. The notes weren't threats. They were messages in a bottle, sent from the deep, dark ocean of his own mind, hoping his conscious self would one day find them. The horror wasn't that he was losing his mind. The horror was that his mind, in its grief, had found a way to become whole again in the dark without his permission. He was not one person, but two. One who lived in the light of day, and one who walked in the night, carving beautiful, impossible memories from the forgotten wood of his own soul. A shopping list for a crime you didn't commit. A warning from a part of you that knows you're being watched. A confession to a murder that wasn't real. And a final message from a memory trying to find its way home. These stories peel back the thin layer of our conscious mind and reveal the terrifying, unknown wilderness that lies beneath. The true horror in these accounts isn't a ghost or a monster. It's the loss of the self. It's the chilling, undeniable proof that we are not the sole pilots of our own bodies. What do you do when your own hand becomes a traitor? When your own mind keeps secrets from you, you are left with a terrifying uncertainty, a permanent question mark hanging over every moment of forgotten time, every lapse in memory. These stories show us that the most frightening messages are not the ones that come from the outside world, but the ones that bubble up from the deep, dark, and often unknowable abyss of our own subconscious. And they leave us with a final, chilling thought. You may think you are alone in your own mind, but you can never be entirely sure. If these stories made you question the words you write, prove your consciousness by subscribing to Whispered Fear, leaving a like, and sharing this video. Your support helps us decipher these terrifying messages from the void. But sometimes, the threat isn't coming from inside your mind. It's coming from inside your walls. Click the video on your screen now for our next collection. 6 true scary stories of people who lived in your walls. See you there, if you dare to listen to the sounds of your own house.